To celebrate the 100th running of the Indianapolis 500, I have created a series of videos highlighting the top 10 moments of the race per decade. The first decade that will be highlighted is the 1960s. Number 10, 50th Anniversaries. This year will be the 100th running of the Indianapolis 500, but 50 years ago, there was just as big a deal for the 50th running. There were actually two 50th anniversary celebrations, the first in 1961 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the inaugural race, and the second in 1966 to celebrate the 50th running. It's somewhat hard to believe, but 50 years later, the 100th running is about to happen. Number 9, the 1967 starting lineup. The 1967 field could perhaps be the greatest field to ever start the Indianapolis 500. 9 drivers who had previously won or would later win the Indianapolis 500 were in it. There were also 6 former or future Formula One World Drivers' Champions and 4 future Daytona 500 winners. Here are just some of the drivers in the field: Parnelli Jones, Mario Andretti, Jim Clark, Dan Gurney, Cale Yarborough, Alan Bobby Unser, and winner AJ Foyt. Number 8, the Rathman-Ward Duel. The 1960 race quickly turned into a battle between defending winner Roger Ward and 3-time runner-up Jim Rathman. The two would lead for a combined 158 laps. However, Ward stalled his engine twice on his first pit stop. He did manage to move up to the front of the field again, but in the process, he would wear out his right front tire at a greater rate. With 3 laps to go, Ward had to slow down his pace to conserve the tire, which was starting to have its cord show. This caused Rathman to take the lead for good and win his only Indianapolis 500. Number 7, the 150-mile-per-hour speed barrier. Today, Indy cars go at speeds of nearly 230 miles per hour at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, but in 1962, they were still working at getting to 150 miles per hour. The closest anybody had come was in 1960 when Jim Hurtubise went 149.056 miles per hour for his average and 149.601 for his best lap. 1962 would also be the first year that the entire track was paved, meaning that cars were expected to go faster. Second-year driver Parnelli Jones would make his qualifying run and would break the speed barrier on each of his laps for an average of 150.37 miles per hour and a best lap of 150.729 miles per hour. Jones would be the only driver to have an average, or even just set a lap, over 150 miles per hour that year in qualifying. Number 6, Turbine Cars. During the latter part of the 1960s, a few different teams and car builders experimented with turbine-powered cars. However, the first turbine car came in 1962 when John Zink, whose cars won the 1955 and 1956 races, entered a moored chassis with a Boeing turbine engine in it for Dan Gurney. Gurney would leave the team to drive for Mickey Thompson, and the car would fail to qualify. The next turbine came in 1966 when Jack Adams inserted a turbine engine in an Epperly Roadster, a car that had been competing since 1958 and was obsolete in its original configuration with the advent of rear-engine cars. Bill Cheeseburg would be the driver. The car would struggle with poor throttle response and braking and would fail to qualify. The most famous turbine car would appear in 1967 when Andy Granatelli, the man who brought the Novi engine back to the 500 starting in 1961, entered a turbine car of his own design for 1963 winner Parnelli Jones. Jones would qualify in 6th place and would take the lead going into the back straightaway on the first lap. Jones would dominate the race and would lead for 184 laps, despite being involved in a spin with Leroy Yarborough on lap 52. However, a $6 transmission bearing would fail with 4 laps to go, and Jones would retire from the race to finish in 6th place. 1968 would have 4 different turbines entered. Carroll Shelby would enter a pair of cars with General Electric turbines, and then for Formula One drivers Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme. However, the cars were withdrawn for unknown reasons. It has been speculated that they were in violation of the rules, that they weren't competitive enough, or even a combination of both. Anniversaries would be involved with the remaining 2 types. His turbines from 1967 returned with Jones driving. Jones would leave the car as he thought it wouldn't be competitive enough with new inlet rules, which reduced the amount of air going to the car and would reduce its power. Jones would never return to the 500. Joe Leonard would replace him, but would crash the car. Granatelli would also partner with Team Lotus, who he had sponsored since 1966, to field a group of Lotus 56s with Pratt & Whitney turbines. The team was to consisted of Jim Clark, Mike Spence, Jackie Stewart, and Graham Hill. Clark and Spence were fatally injured in racing accidents, with Spence's occurring during practice for the 500. Stewart was recovering from a racing injury. As a result, Leonard and Art Pollard became their replacement drivers. Leonard would qualify on the pole position with Hill in 2nd and Pollard 11th. In the race, Hill would crash out after 110 laps, and Pollard had fuel shaft issues after 188 laps. Leonard would lead for 31 laps and was leading with 9 laps to go when he too suffered a fuel shaft issue and would get credited with 12th place. The Bryant car would return in 1969 with Al Miller driving it. Jim McElreath, who would drive and qualify Jack Adams' more conventional Bronner Hawk Offenhauser in the race, would also test it. Neither would get any success out of the car, and it would fail to qualify again. The final appearance of a turbine car was in 1970 when Jigger Savoy drove a newly redesigned Bryant car with a Pratt & Whitney turbine. Teammate Rick Muther drove the car in practice also, but would qualify the Bronner Hawk instead. Soroy would make a qualifying attempt, but was too slow to bump his way into the field. Changing regulations, which had been in effect since 1968 and were only countered by the Lotus design, caused most of these designs to struggle. In total, only 4 turbine cars would ever qualify for the Indianapolis 500, 1 Granatelli design, and 3 Lotuses. Number 5. Mario Andretti's win. The name Andretti is synonymous with racing, especially IndyCar racing. Despite this, only once has any member of the Andretti family to start the Indianapolis 500 won it. That was in 1969 with Mario Andretti in his 5th 500. Andretti would begin to drive for STP Granatelli Racing that year. He was originally going to drive a Lotus 64 Ford V8, but a massive practice accident would destroy the car. A backup Hawk 3 Ford V8 was brought in, and he would qualify in 2nd place. In the first half of the race, Andretti battled with pole sitter A.J. Foyt. On lap 99, Foyt had a 20-minute pit stop for a split manifold. Andretti would have no competition after Lloyd Ruby's fuel hose ripped his fuel tank open during a pit stop. Andretti would go on to win the race, despite hitting chief mechanic Clint Bronner on his final pit stop. It would also be the first win for car owner Andy Granatelli, who had been entering cars since 1946, and Andretti has finished 2nd in the race 4 times since 1969 and have several times come close to winning, but they couldn't quite pull it off. Perhaps Marco Andretti could break the Andretti curse in the 100th running. Number 4. The 1964 Fatal Crash. Auto racing has proven time and time again that it is a dangerous game. On the 2nd lap of the 1964 race, Dave McDonald lost control in turn 4. He would hit the inside wall and his car would explode into flames. The car would then slide across the track and into the path of several cars. Eddie Sachs attempted to make it through the accident by going through an opening along the outside wall. However, McDonald's car moved in front of him and he would be hit broadside by McDonald's car. The race was immediately red flagged for the first time in the race's history. Sachs would be killed instantly due to blunt force injuries. McDonald was sent to the infield hospital, but he would also die due to inhaling flames. The crash would also cause a ban on gasoline being used in the cars, being replaced by methanol in 1965, and would also cause the cars to carry smaller amounts of fuel. Number 3. The start of the rear engine revolution. By 1961, rear engine cars were the norm in Formula One. In the USAC National Championship, the exact opposite could be said. At the Indianapolis 500 that year, two-time defending World Drivers' Champion Jack Brabham was entered in a Cooper T54 Climax that was similar to the type of car he drove in Formula One. Brabham would qualify in 13th place and would run as high as 3rd before finishing 9th. The car was slower on the straightaways than its front-engine counterparts, but lost very little speed in the turns. Other manufacturers took notice, and by 1967, the entire field was made up of rear-engine cars. Number 2. The last front-engined winner. By 1964, it was clear that rear-engine cars would be the future of IndyCar racing. The front row would consist of only rear-engine cars. Parnelli Jones and A.J. Foyt would be the highest starting front-engined cars in 4th and 5th place. In the race, the Lotuses of Jim Clark and Bobby Marshman would lead the first 47 laps. However, Marshman would suffer an oil pump failure after 39 laps, and Clark would have suspension damage after 47 laps. Jones would take the lead and would battle with Foyt. As the two were exiting their pit stalls, Jones's car caught fire and he would retire from the race. Foyt would lead the remaining 146 laps without challenge and would go on to win the race. The win was the last for a front-engined car at the 500. By the next year, even drivers like Foyt and Jones were in rear-engine Lotuses. And the number one Indianapolis 500 moment of the 1960s is the first rear-engined winner. Rear-engine cars had been showing up in greater numbers each year at the Indianapolis 500 since 1961, and it was inevitable that one would eventually win the race. In 1965, Jim Clark qualified in second place in a Lotus 38 Ford V8. He would take the lead on the first lap of the race and would lose it briefly to A.J. Foyt on the second lap before regaining it on the third lap. Clark would only lose the lead again when he had to make a pit stop, causing Foyt to reclaim the lead. In all, Clark led 190 laps on his way to get the first victory for a rear-engine car. Only twice after the race would a front-engine car start the 500, neither lasting more than 9 laps. The 1960s had their moments of excitement, tragedy, and innovation, and it would set the stage for the next several decades at the Brickyard.